I spent 32 years celebrating the wrong heritage, speaking the wrong prayers, and mourning ancestors who weren't even mine. My name is Marcus, and for 32 years of my life, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was the proud son of Elena Rossetti, a fiery Italian-American woman who could make pasta sauce that would make your grandmother weep with envy, and Roberto Rossetti, whose family had been in Boston's North End since the 1920s. Our Sunday dinners were legendary affairs with wine flowing like water, animated conversations in broken Italian mixed with Boston accents, and enough garlic bread to feed a small village. Growing up in our cramped but warm apartment above my father's barber shop, I was surrounded by the rich tapestry of Italian-American culture. The smell of fresh basil always lingered in our hallways, and you couldn't walk 10 feet without seeing a picture of the Pope, a statue of the Virgin Mary, or both. My mother would cross herself every time an ambulance passed by, muttering quick prayers in Italian that she'd learned from her own mother, who'd come over from Sicily in the 1950s. I learned to speak Italian before I could properly pronounce my R's in English. Every summer, we'd plan elaborate trips to visit our extended family in the old country, though we never quite had enough money to make it happen. Instead, we'd settle for day trips to the Italian festivals in the surrounding neighborhoods, where I'd stuff my face with cannoli and watch my parents dance to accordion music with tears in their eyes. The barbershop was like a second home to me. After school, I had to sit in the corner doing homework, while my father told stories to his customers about the old neighborhood, about how things used to be when families stuck together and everyone knew their neighbors. He'd de-ruffle my dark hair and tell anyone who'd listen that I was going to be the first Rossetti to graduate from college, the one who'd make something of himself in America. My mother worked as a seamstress in a small shop downtown, and she'd come home with her fingers pricked from needles, but she never complained. She'd immediately start dinner, humming old Italian songs while she chopped onions and tomatoes. She had this way of moving around the kitchen like she was dancing. She'd always taste everything 3 times before declaring it ready. Cooking is love made visible, she'd say, spooning extra sauce onto my plate. The neighborhood we lived in was a melting pot, but our Italian identity was the thread that held our family together. We attended St. Anthony's Catholic Church every Sunday without fail, where Father Giuseppe would give his sermons in a mixture of English and Italian, and my mother would sing along to hymns in a voice that was slightly off-key but full of devotion. After Mass, we'd stop by Romano's Market to pick up fresh bread and imported cheese, exchanging pleasantries with other Italian families who'd been fixtures in the community for decades. I threw myself into this identity with the enthusiasm of a young man trying to make his family proud. In high school, I joined the Italian-American Student Association, where I learned traditional dances and helped organize cultural events. I dated Maria Benedetti for 2 years, a sweet girl whose family had known mine since before I was born. Her grandmother would pinch my cheeks and tell my mother what a handsome boy she'd raised. And for a while it seemed like our families were just waiting for us to announce our engagement. But life had other plans. When I turned 18, I received a partial scholarship to study engineering at a state university, 2 hours away from home. My parents cried when I left, but they were bursting with pride. I was their American dream made manifest, the son who would elevate the family name beyond the confines of our small neighborhood. I promised to come home every weekend, to never forget where I came from, to always remember that family comes first. College opened my eyes to a bigger world, but I never lost sight of my roots. I'd bring friends home for dinner, and my mother would immediately adopt them, insisting they weren't eating enough and packing them leftovers to take back to their dorms. My father would regale them with stories about the neighborhood, about the time he caught a purse snatcher or helped deliver a baby during a snowstorm. They loved my parents, and my parents loved having a house full of young people to feed and fuss over. During my junior year, I met Rebecca Chen in my thermodynamics class. She was brilliant, funny, and had this way of explaining complex equations that made everything click for me. She was Chinese American, and her family had immigrated from Taiwan when she was just 5 years old. When I brought her home for the first time, I was nervous about how my parents would react, but they welcomed her with open arms. My mother immediately started asking about Chinese cooking techniques, and my father insisted on teaching her how to say beautiful girl in Italian. Rebecca and I fell in love over late-night study sessions and shared dreams of building something meaningful together. She introduced me to her family's traditions, and I shared mine with her. We talked about how we'd blend our cultures when we had children someday, how we'd make sure they understood the richness of both their heritages. She learned to make my mother's sauce recipe, and I fumbled my way through using chopsticks at her family's dinner table. After graduation, Rebecca and I moved in together in a small apartment near downtown Boston. I got a job at an engineering firm, and she started graduate school in computer science. We'd have my parents over for dinner once a week, and my mother would inevitably rearrange our kitchen and stock our refrigerator with enough food to last a month. "You're too skinny," she'd tell Rebecca, who was actually perfectly healthy, but had committed the sin of being smaller than my mother's ideal. When Rebecca and I got engaged after 3 years of dating, the whole neighborhood celebrated. Mrs. Torino from next door brought over homemade wine, and Mr. Castellano offered to cater our reception at cost. The wedding planning became a community effort, with every Italian grandmother in a 5-block radius offering advice, recipes, and family heirlooms. My mother cried happy tears for weeks, telling anyone who'd listen that she was gaining a daughter, not losing a son. Our wedding was a beautiful blend of Italian and Chinese traditions. We had a traditional Catholic ceremony at St. Anthony's, followed by a tea ceremony for Rebecca's family. The reception was held at the local community center, decorated with both red Chinese lanterns and Italian flags. My father gave a speech in broken English and perfect emotion, welcoming Rebecca to our family and promising that our children would know they belonged to something bigger than themselves. 2 years into our marriage, Rebecca gave birth to our son, David. He was perfect in every way, with dark hair like mine and Rebecca's beautiful almond-shaped eyes. My parents were over the moon, with my mother immediately declaring herself Nonna Alina and my father practicing lullabies in Italian to sing to his grandson. They'd come over every day after work, bringing dinner and fighting over who got to hold the baby longer. As David grew older, the differences between our family traditions became more apparent, but in a wonderful way. He'd bow respectfully to Rebecca's parents and kiss my mother's cheek in greeting. He could count to 10 in 3 languages before he turned 4. And he knew that Sunday meant pasta at Nonna C's house, and Saturday meant dim sum with Grandma Chen. We were raising a little boy who understood that identity could be beautifully complex, that love transcended cultural boundaries. My father would take David to the barbershop on Saturday mornings, teaching him the names of all the regular customers and letting him sweep up hair clippings. "This is your heritage," he'd tell him. "This is where your family comes from." David would nod solemnly, understanding that this place, these people, this history was part of who he was supposed to be. But children have a way of seeing things that adults miss, and David was no exception. As he grew older, he started asking questions that seemed innocent at the time, but would later shake the foundation of everything I thought I knew about myself. "Why don't I look like Nana Roberto?" he'd ask, studying our family photos with the intense concentration that only a 6-year-old can muster. "Why are my eyes different from yours, Papa?" I'd laugh off these questions, explaining that genetics were complicated, that he looked like a perfect combination of his mother and father. But privately, I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. David had Rebecca's eyes, yes, but he also had her straight black hair and her delicate bone structure. When I looked at baby pictures of myself, I saw my mother's olive complexion and my father's strong jaw. But David looked nothing like those old photographs. The doubt started as a whisper in the back of my mind, easily dismissed and forgotten in the chaos of daily life. Rebecca was working full-time now, and I was putting in long hours at the firm. We were busy, happy, and completely unprepared for the questions that were about to turn our world upside down. Looking back, I can see that the signs were always there.
Waiting
For someone brave enough or foolish enough to start connecting the dots. But that someone wouldn't be me, at least not yet. The first crack in my carefully constructed identity came from an unexpected source. My son's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson. It was during David's parent-teacher conference in the spring when he was 7 years old. Rebecca and I sat in those tiny plastic chairs that made every adult feel like a giant, listening as Mrs. Patterson praised David's academic progress and his kind nature with his classmates. "He's such a bright boy," she said, flipping through his portfolio of schoolwork, "and so interested in learning about different cultures. We've been doing a unit on family heritage. And David has been sharing stories about both his Italian and Chinese backgrounds." She paused, looking at us with a slightly puzzled expression. Oh, I have to say, when he brought in that family photo for our heritage wall, some of the other children were confused. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. Confused about what? Mrs. Patterson seemed to realize she might be treading on sensitive ground. Oh, it's nothing really. Kids just notice things, you know. A few of them asked David why he looked so different from his father. Children can be so observant sometimes. She laughed nervously. Of course, I explained that families come in all different combinations, and that's what makes them special. We'd had this conversation before, but hearing it from a teacher in the context of other children asking questions made it feel more real somehow. David's never mentioned anything to us about this, Rebecca said carefully. He just said that he got his looks from his mama and his personality from his papa. Such a sweet boy. But her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and I could tell she was thinking the same thing those 7-year-olds had been thinking. That night after David was asleep, Rebecca and I found ourselves having a conversation we'd both been avoiding. She said, curled up next to me on the couch. My sister mentioned something similar at David's birthday party last month. She asked if maybe he got his features from your mother's side of the family. The same thing we always say, the genetics are unpredictable, that he's a perfect blend of both of us. She was quiet for a moment. But Marcus, I've been looking at our baby pictures, and David really doesn't look like you did at his age. I wanted to dismiss her concerns, to rationalize away the doubts that had been growing stronger with each passing month, but I couldn't ignore the evidence that was literally sleeping down the hall from us. David was beautiful, brilliant, and everything I could have asked for in a son, but he looked nothing like me. Nothing like my father, my mother, or any of the Rossetti family photos that lined our hallways. The questions started coming more frequently after that. At David's soccer games, other parents would comment on how much he looked like Rebecca. He's all mama, they'd say with knowing smiles. They meant it as harmless small talk, but each comment felt like a tiny dagger to my confidence. Look at those hands, she'd say, grabbing David's small fingers in her weathered ones. But when I looked, all I could see were Rebecca's elegant, tapered fingers and her mother's delicate wrists. The breaking point came during a family dinner at my parents' house in late summer, when my Uncle Tony made an observation that stopped all conversation cold. He said, gesturing with a piece of bread toward David, this kid looks exactly like Rebecca's family. He laughed at his own joke, completely oblivious to the tension that suddenly filled the room. My mother shot him a warning look. Tony, that's enough. I'm just saying usually you can see both parents in a kid, This little guy, though, he's all Chen family. The silence that followed was deafening. David, sensing the adult tension but not understanding its source, continued eating his spaghetti with the focused determination of a 7-year-old. Rebecca reached for her wine glass with hands that weren't quite steady. My father cleared his throat and changed the subject to the Red Sox season, but the damage was already done. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about Uncle Tony's words. They echoed every private doubt I'd been carrying. Every uncomfortable moment when strangers assumed David wasn't my biological son. Every time I'd looked in the mirror searching for some feature we shared and coming up empty. We should do a DNA test, Rebecca said quietly into the darkness. My heart stopped. What? You heard me? We should do one of those paternity tests, just to put all of this to rest once and for all. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the underlying tremor of fear. I'm tired of wondering. I'm tired of seeing you wonder. I don't wonder, I lied. Marcus. She turned to face me, and even in the dim light from the street lamp outside, I could see the concern in her eyes. You've been different lately, Distant. I see the way you look at David sometimes, like you're searching for something you can't find. This isn't fair to any of us. A DNA test feels like we don't trust each other. Or it feels like we finally being honest about the questions we both afraid to ask out loud. She reached for my hand under the covers. I know I've never been unfaithful to you. But there are other explanations, Marcus. Medical ones. Maybe your parents need to have some conversations about your family history that they've never had before. The thought hit me like a physical blow. Possibility that my entire identity, everything I'd built my sense of self around, might be based on a lie I'd never even considered. What if I wasn't Roberto Rossetti's son? What if the man who'd raised me, who'd taught me how to shave, and how to treat people with respect, and how to make a decent marinara sauce, wasn't my biological father? I I whispered. You can't what? I can't find out that my whole life has been a lie. I couldn't discover that the man I've looked up to my entire life isn't really my father. I can't handle that right now. Rebecca was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle, but firm. And I can't handle watching you torture yourself with questions that have answers. David deserves parents who aren't constantly second-guessing their relationship to him. We all deserve the truth, whatever it is. Over the next few weeks, the conversation would resurface again and again. Sometimes it was triggered by innocent comments from friends or family. Sometimes by my own reflection in the mirror, next to David's face. Sometimes by nothing more than the persistent ache of uncertainty that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. Rebecca started researching DNA testing companies online, bookmarking pages about paternity tests and ancestry analysis. She'd leave her laptop open to these sites, a not-so-subtle hint that she was serious about moving forward. Meanwhile, I found myself studying my parents' faces with new intensity, looking for any signs of deception or discomfort when the subject of David's appearance came up. My mother seemed genuinely oblivious to any concerns, continuing to point out imaginary similarities between David and various Rossetti relatives. But my father had grown quieter during our family dinners, and I caught him watching me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I'd ask if everything was okay, he'd just nod and change the subject. But the feeling that he was hiding something continued to grow. The final straw came during David's school science fair. He'd created a project about genetic inheritance, complete with Punnett squares and probability charts explaining how traits pass from parents to children. As we stood there looking at his carefully constructed display, surrounded by other families admiring their children's work, the irony felt too heavy to bear. Look, Papa, David said, pointing to a section of his poster about eye color genetics. This shows why I have Mama's eyes instead of yours. It's because brown eyes are dominant and blue eyes are recessive, so I got the brown-eyed genes from Mama. I stared at his innocent face, at his complete acceptance of the scientific explanation for our differences, and felt something break inside me. This beautiful, brilliant boy had figured out more about genetics in second grade than I'd wanted to confront as a grown man. He deserved parents who could face the truth with the same courage he brought to his science project. That night, I found Rebecca in our home office, once again looking at DNA testing websites. This time I didn't walk away. Order the test, I said. She looked up at me with surprise and relief. Are you sure? No, but I'm tired of being afraid of the truth. David deserves better than parents who are too scared to face reality. I sat down next to her at the desk. Whatever we find out, we'll handle it together, as a family. She nodded and clicked the order button before I could change my mind. The test kit would arrive in 3 to 5 business days, and with it, answers to questions I'd spent months trying to avoid. I had no idea that those answers would shatter everything I thought I knew about myself and rebuild it into something I never could have imagined. The waiting had begun. The DNA test kit arrived on a Thursday afternoon. It's delivered in a plain brown box that seemed far too ordinary for something that might completely upend my life. Rebecca signed for it while I was at work, and when I came home that evening, I found it sitting on our kitchen counter like an unexploded bomb wrapped in postal packaging. It's here, Rebecca said unnecessarily, as we both stared at the box over our dinner of leftover Chinese takeout. David was at the kitchen table with us, working on his homework with the focused concentration that made me so proud of him, completely unaware that his parents were contemplating a decision that could change everything. Can we talk about this after he goes to bed? I asked, nodding toward David. Rebecca agreed, but I could see the impatience in her eyes. She'd been ready for answers for weeks now. While I was still fighting the urge to throw the whole kit in the garbage and pretend we'd never ordered it, the rational part of my brain knew that ignorance wasn't going to make our questions disappear. But the scared part of me wondered if some truths were better left buried. That night, after David had brushed his teeth and been tucked into bed with his favorite story about a dragon who was afraid of heights, Rebecca and I finally opened the kit. Inside were 3 small tubes for saliva samples. Detailed instructions that seemed more complex than they needed to be. And prepaid shipping labels that would carry our genetic material off to a laboratory where strangers would unravel the mysteries. We'd been too afraid to face ourselves. It's so simple, Rebecca said, reading through the instructions. Just spit in the tube, mail it back, and wait for results. 2 to 3 weeks for processing. Simple, I repeated. though nothing about this felt simple to me. So we test me and David. Actually, Rebecca said, pointing to the fine print, they recommend testing both parents if there are questions about paternity. It helps them establish more accurate results and rule out any lab errors. The word paternity hung in the air between us like a living thing. Until that moment, we'd been dancing around the real question we were asking. We'd talked about genetics and family resemblance and scientific curiosity, but we hadn't said the actual words out loud. I might not be David's biological father, okay? I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. We all get tested, are you sure? Because once we know, we can't unknow it. I looked around our kitchen, at the family photos covering the refrigerator, at David's artwork hanging on the walls, at the life we'd built together based on assumptions that might be completely wrong. I'm sure. Or at least, I'm as sure as I can be about something that terrifies me. We decided to collect the samples that night while our resolve was still strong, and before I could talk myself out of it again. Rebecca went first, spitting into her tube with the matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything in her life. Your turn, she said, handing me my kit. I stared at the small plastic container, thinking about how something so insignificant could hold such enormous power over our family's future. My saliva would either confirm that I was David's biological father, validating 7 years of love and connection and shared experiences, or it would reveal that the most important relationship in my life was built on a foundation I had never questioned. Marcus, Rebecca said gently, we don't have to do this if you're not ready. No, I am ready. I wasn't, but I needed to be. It's just, what if the results change how I feel about David? What if I can't love him the same way if he's not really mine? Rebecca's expression softened with understanding. Do you think your love for him is conditional on sharing DNA? Of course not, I said immediately. He's my son no matter what. Then prove it. To yourself, and to him and to me. She squeezed my hand. Love isn't about genetics, Marcus. It's about choice. You've chosen to be David's father every day for 7 years. A test result can't change that unless you let it. I collected my sample and sealed it in the tube, writing my name on the label with handwriting that looked shakier than usual. Then came the hardest part. David's sample. We'd already discussed how to approach this with him, deciding that honesty was the best policy, even if we kept the explanation ejapperate. The next morning over breakfast, Rebecca brought up the subject with the casual tone she used when introducing new concepts to David. Hey, buddy, remember your science fair project about genetics? David looked up from his cereal, milk dripping from his spoon. The one about why I look like you instead of Papa. That's the one. Well, Papa and I thought it might be fun to do a real genetic test, like the scientists do. We can learn about our family history and where our ancestors came from. David's eyes lit up with the excitement he showed for any new learning opportunity, like a real science experiment. Exactly like that, I said, finding my voice. We just need to collect a little spit from you in this special tube, and then scientists in a laboratory will study it and tell us all kinds of interesting things about our family. Will it hurt? Not at all. It's just like spitting, but into a container instead of on the ground. David thought about this for a moment, then nodded enthusiastically. Can I see the results when they come back? Of course, Rebecca said. We'll look at them together and talk about what they mean. Collecting David's sample was surprisingly easy. He approached it with the same scientific curiosity he brought to everything else, asking questions about DNA and laboratories, and how scientists could learn so much from something as ordinary as saliva. His innocent enthusiasm made me feel both better and worse about what we were doing. Better because his reaction reminded me that this was just science, not some betrayal of our family bond. Worse because he had no idea that his spit might reveal secrets that could change how he understood his place in the world. We packaged up all 3 samples and drove to the post office that afternoon. Standing in line with our prepaid envelope, I felt like I was mailing away pieces of our family's soul to be examined by strangers. The postal worker who took our package was friendly and efficient, treating it like any other mail, completely unaware that she was handling what might be the most important delivery of my life. How long did they say for results? I asked Rebecca as we walked back to the car. 2 to 3 weeks. They'll email us when the analysis is complete. 2 to 3 weeks. It seemed like both forever and no time at all. Part of me wanted the results immediately, to end the suspense and uncertainty that had been growing for months. But another part of me hoped the testing would somehow take much longer, giving me more time to prepare for whatever truth was waiting for us. The first week passed slowly. I found myself checking my email obsessively, even though I knew it was too early for results. Rebecca seemed calmer about the waiting, but I caught her looking at David sometimes with the same searching expression I'd been wearing for months. Were we both trying to memorize the way things were now, just in case everything was about to change? During the second week, I started having dreams about the results. Sometimes they confirmed that David was my biological son, and I'd wake up feeling relieved and guilty about having doubted our relationship. Other times they revealed that he wasn't, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat, terrified about what that might mean for our family. The worst dreams were the ones where the results were somehow inconclusive, leaving us with even more questions than we'd started with. Rebecca and I didn't talk much about the test during those weeks of waiting, but it was always there between us, an invisible presence at our dinner table and in our conversations with David. We were both trying to act normal, to maintain the routines and rhythms that had always defined our family life. But there was an undercurrent of tension that even David seemed to sense. "Are you and Mama fighting?" He asked me one night as I was tucking him into bed. "No, buddy. Why would you think that? You both seem sad lately, and you keep looking at me funny." My heart broke a little bit. Not sad, and we're definitely not fighting. Sometimes grown-ups have things on their minds that make them seem quiet, but it has nothing to do with you. Is it about the science test we did? I was amazed by his perceptiveness, sort of. We're just excited to see the results, and waiting is hard sometimes. "I'm excited too," he said, snuggling deeper into his covers. "I hope we learned cool stuff about our family." "Me too, buddy. Me too." As the third week began, I started preparing myself emotionally for whatever the results might reveal. I made lists in my head of all the ways our family would remain strong regardless of what we learned. I practiced conversations with David about genetics and family and love that transcends biology. I even started researching support groups for families dealing with paternity questions, though I couldn't bring myself to actually contact any of them. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for work. My phone buzzed with a notification, and when I saw the sender's address was from the DNA testing company, my hands started shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen to read the message. "Your DNA analysis is complete. Please log into your account to view your results." That was it. No preview, no hint about what we were about to discover. Just a simple notification that our genetic secrets were now available for viewing with the click of a button. Rebecca was in the shower, and David was still asleep. I stood alone in our bedroom, holding my phone and staring at the message that would either validate everything I thought I knew about my family or turn my world upside down. All I had to do was open the app, enter my password, and face the truth I'd been afraid to confront for months. Instead, I set the phone down on the dresser and finished getting ready for work. Some revelations, I decided, were too important to face alone. I called in sick to work that day, something I'd done maybe 3 times in my entire career. Rebecca immediately knew something was wrong when she came out of the bathroom to find me still in my pajamas, staring at my phone like it contained either salvation or damnation. "They're ready, aren't they?" she said, not really asking a question. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The email notification was still glowing on my screen, those innocent-looking words carrying the weight of our family's future. I couldn't look at them alone. Rebecca sat down next to me on the edge of our bed, her hair still damp from the shower, and took my free hand in both of hers. "Whatever they say, we'll handle it together." That's what we promised each other. What if I'm not his father, and you're still the man who taught him to ride a bike, who reads him stories every night, who shows up to every soccer game and school play? DNA doesn't change any of that. I knew she was right, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your bones are two different things entirely. David was still asleep down the hall, blissfully unaware that his parents were about to discover something that might change how they understood their place in his life. "Should we wake him up? Do this as a family?" I asked. Rebecca considered this. "Let's look at the results first. We can decide together how to share them with him based on what we find." I opened the DNA testing app with fingers that felt clumsy and disconnected from my brain. The login screen appeared asking for my password, and for a moment I couldn't remember the combination of letters and numbers I'd chosen just a few weeks ago. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold on a movie screen. The dashboard loaded, showing 3 profiles: mine, Rebecca's, and David's. Each had a green check mark indicating that results were available. I clicked on the family relationship analysis first, the section that would answer the question that had been haunting me for months. The screen that loaded was clean and simple, with a diagram showing genetic connections between the three of us. Rebecca and David were connected with a solid line labeled mother-son, 99.99% probability. That was expected, reassuring in its certainty. But the line between David and me told a different story entirely. Father-son, 0% probability. Biological relationship, none detected. I stared at those words until they blurred in front of my eyes. Rebecca drew in a sharp breath beside me, her hand tightening around mine. The clinical language of the report couldn't soften the brutal reality of what we were seeing. David was not my biological son. Marcus, Rebecca whispered, but I couldn't respond. I was too busy trying to process how my entire understanding of my family had just crumbled in the space of a single sentence. The detailed report offered additional information that felt like salt in an open wound. David and I shared no significant genetic markers. There was no possibility of laboratory error. The results had been double-checked and verified. The man who had been raising this beautiful boy for 7 years, would change his diapers and soothed his nightmares and taught him how to throw a baseball, was genetically no relation to him whatsoever. But that wasn't the end of the revelations waiting for us. Rebecca clicked on the ancestry composition section, and what we found there was almost more shocking than the paternity results. My genetic profile showed a breakdown that made no sense given everything I thought I knew about my family history. 53% Northern European, Rebecca read aloud. 28% Middle Eastern and North African, 15% Sub-Saharan African, 4% unassigned. I stared at the colorful pie chart that was supposed to represent my heritage. There was no Italian ancestry listed anywhere. Not even a trace amount that might have been misclassified or diluted by generations of genetic mixing. According to this analysis, I had no Italian blood running through my veins. This can't be right, I said, though I knew that DNA testing had become incredibly accurate and reliable. There has to be some mistake. Rebecca pulled up her own ancestry results for comparison. Her profile showed exactly what we'd expected. 55% East Asian, 30% Northern European, 12% Indigenous American, with smaller percentages of other regions. It aligned perfectly with her known family history of Chinese and Irish grandparents. But my results looked like they belonged to a completely different person than the Italian-American man I'd believed myself to be for 32 years. The largest component of my ancestry was Northern European, possibly Irish, German, Scandinavian, followed by significant Middle Eastern and African heritage. The combination suggested a family history that was complex and multicultural in ways that had never been discussed or acknowledged by anyone in my family. Maybe there was a mix-up at the lab, I said weakly. Maybe they switched my sample with someone else's. Marcus. Rebecca's voice was gentle but firm. That's not what happened here. She was right. And somewhere beneath my shock and denial, I knew it too. The paternity results and the ancestry analysis were telling the same story from different angles. The man I'd always believed to be my father wasn't my biological parent, and my actual genetic heritage bore no resemblance to the Italian-American identity I'd built my entire sense of self around. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us trying to absorb the magnitude of what we'd just discovered. The morning light streaming through our bedroom window felt different somehow, as if the world itself had shifted while we weren't paying attention. I could hear David stirring in his room down the hall, the normal sounds of a 7-year-old waking up on a day that felt anything but normal. "So I'm not Italian," I said finally, my voice sounding strange and hollow to my own ears. "And David isn't yours," Rebecca added quietly. "But he is mine," I said quickly, almost angrily. "He's been mine for 7 years. He's mine in every way that matters." "Of course he is. I didn't mean I know what you meant." I set the phone down and put my head in my hands. "I'm sorry. I'm just trying to figure out how everything I thought I knew about myself could be wrong." Rebecca moved closer to me on the bed, wrapping her arms around my shoulders. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about my mother's face when she talks about her family in Sicily. I'm thinking about all those stories my father tells about growing up in the North End, about how his grandfather came over from Italy with nothing but hope and determination. I'm thinking about every Sunday dinner, every family tradition, every part of my identity that was built on something that apparently never existed." The sound of David's bedroom door opening made us both freeze. His footsteps padded down the hallway toward the kitchen. where he'd expect to find breakfast waiting and parents who had their lives figured out. Instead, he was going to find two adults who had just discovered that their family was built on secrets they'd never even suspected existed. "Papa, Mama?" David's voice called from the kitchen. "Where is everyone?" Rebecca and I looked at each other, both of us thinking the same thing. How do you face your child when you've just learned that genetics have played a cruel joke on your family? How do you maintain the normal rhythm of morning routines when your understanding of reality has just been completely overturned? "We should go downstairs," Rebecca said. "He'll wonder what's wrong if we stay up here much longer." I nodded, though I had no idea how I was going to pretend everything was normal. David was standing at the kitchen counter in his dinosaur pajamas, trying to reach the cereal boxes in the cabinet above the sink. When he saw us, his face lit up with the uncomplicated joy that children bring to ordinary moments. "Can we see the science results today?" he asked excitedly. "It said they might be ready this week." The irony of his question hit me like a physical blow. He was eager to learn about the genetics that connected our family, completely unaware that those same genetics had just revealed how disconnected we really were. But looking at his bright, curious face, I realized something that the shock of the test results had temporarily obscured. This boy was still the most important person in my world, regardless of what any laboratory analysis might say. "The results came back this morning," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Really? What did we learn? Are we related to anyone famous? Do we have ancestors from cool places?" Rebecca and I exchanged glances over his head. We'd discussed how to handle this conversation in theory, but neither of us had anticipated the complexity of emotions we'd be dealing with ourselves. "Well," Rebecca said carefully, "we learned some very interesting things about our family. Some of them were surprising. Good surprising or bad surprising. Just surprising," I said. "Sometimes science teaches us things we didn't expect to learn." We made breakfast together, the three of us moving around the kitchen in the familiar dance we'd perfected over years of shared mornings. David chattered about his plans for the day, his upcoming school projects, and whether we could go to the playground that afternoon. His normalcy was both comforting and heartbreaking. A reminder that childhood innocence was a precious thing that deserved protection. After David finished eating and went upstairs to get dressed for the day, Rebecca and I found ourselves alone again with the weight of our new knowledge. "We need to talk to your parents," she said quietly. The thought of confronting my mother and father with these results filled me with dread. What am I supposed to say? "Mom and Dad. Turns out I'm not actually Italian, and David isn't actually your biological grandson. You're going to ask them to tell you the truth about your birth? About who your real father is? And why they never told you? What if they don't know? What if my mother had an affair and never told my father? Then at least you'll know that much. Marcus, you can't pretend this didn't happen. You deserve to understand your real family history, and David deserves to know his too." She was right, of course, but the prospect of having these conversations felt overwhelming. My parents were in their 70s now, comfortable in their established roles as the Italian grandparents, who spoiled David with homemade cookies and endless stories about the old country. How could I shatter their world the same way mine had just been shattered? "And what about David?" I asked. "What do we tell him about why he doesn't look like me?" "We tell him the truth in an age-appropriate way. We explain that sometimes families are created through love rather than just genetics, and that the most important thing is that we chose each other every single day." I knew she was right about this too, but the thought of having to explain to my 7-year-old son that I wasn't his biological father made my heart ache, not because it changed how I felt about him, but because I was afraid it might change how he felt about himself, about his place in our family, about the security he'd always taken for granted. The rest of the morning passed in a strange haze of normal activities conducted by people who no longer felt normal. We did laundry, cleaned the house, and took David to his soccer practice, all while carrying the secret of what we'd learned weighing heavily between us. I found myself watching David play with a new intensity, studying his movements and expressions, and wondering about the man who had contributed half of his genetic material, but had never been part of his life. During the drive home from soccer, David fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from running around in the sun. Rebecca and I drove in comfortable silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what came next. "I'm going to call my mother tonight," I said finally. "Do you want me to be there when you talk to her?" "No, this is something I need to do alone, at least at first. But I'm going to need you to help me figure out how to explain all of this to David. We'll figure it out together. That's what families do. That evening, after David was in bed and Rebecca was grading papers at the kitchen table, I sat on our back porch with my phone in my hands, staring at my mother's number in my contacts list. The conversation I was about to have would change everything between us, would force secrets into the light that had been buried for over 3 decades. But I also knew that I couldn't move forward without answers, couldn't build an honest future for my family while living with lies from the past. David deserved parents who could face difficult truths with courage, who could show him that love was stronger than deception, and that real families were built on honesty rather than comfortable fiction. I dialed my mother's number and waited for her to answer, preparing myself for a conversation that would either explain everything or raise even more questions that I wasn't sure I was ready to face. "Marcus, is everything okay?" My mother's voice carried the immediate concern that all parents develop when their children call at unexpected times. "Hi, Mom. Yeah, everything's fine. Well, not fine exactly. I need to talk to you about something important. Is it Rebecca?" "David, are you sick?" "No, Mom, it's about me. It's about our family. I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When my mother finally spoke again, her voice had changed, become smaller somehow. "What kind of questions?" "Mom, am I Dad's biological son?" Another long silence. In the background, I could hear the television playing one of the old Italian movies she loved to watch, the dramatic voices speaking in the language I'd grown up thinking was part of my heritage. "Marcus, why would you ask me something like that?" "Because Rebecca and I got DNA tests done for the whole family. The results don't make sense unless there's something you haven't told me about my birth." I heard her take a shaky breath. "Oh, Marcus, oh my sweet boy." Those words told me everything I needed to know. The anguish in her voice, the way she said my name like an apology, the silence that followed carried 32 years of carefully guarded secrets. I felt my heart breaking not just for myself, but for her, for the burden she'd been carrying all these years. "Mom, I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Can you come over? This isn't something I can explain over the phone. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to my parents' house felt like the longest journey of my life. I'd traveled these familiar streets thousands of times, but tonight everything looked different, like I was seeing the neighborhood through the eyes of a stranger. The Italian flags hanging from front porches, the statue of St. Anthony in the Martinellis front yard, the smell of garlic and tomatoes wafting from open windows. All of it felt like part of someone else's story now. My father was asleep in his recliner when I arrived, the newspaper folded across his chest and his reading glasses sliding down his nose. My mother met me at the door with red eyes and tissues clutched in her hand. She looked older than she had just a few days ago, as if the prospect of this conversation had aged her overnight. "Let's go to the kitchen," she whispered, not wanting to wake my father. "I'll make coffee." We sat at the same Formica table where I'd eaten countless meals as a child, where she'd help me with homework and bandage scraped knees and listen to my teenage problems with infinite patience. And now it felt like we were sitting across from each other as strangers, separated by decades of unspoken truth. "How much do you know?" she asked, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug like she was trying to draw warmth from it. "I know that Dad isn't my biological father. I know that I have no Italian ancestry according to the DNA test. I know that you've been keeping this secret for over 30 years. I paused, watching her face crumble with each revelation. "Mom, who is my real father?" She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths before answering. "His name was James Sullivan. Jimmy. He was Irish, worked construction in the city. I met him the summer before I married your father. The name meant nothing to me, but hearing it felt like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known existed. You had an affair?" "It wasn't an affair," she said quickly. "Ribeiro and I had broken up. We'd been fighting about when to get married, about money, about everything. I was working at the diner downtown that summer, and Jimmy used to come in for lunch with his crew. He was funny and kind, and he made me feel special when everything else in my life felt uncertain. I tried to picture my mother as a young woman, torn between two men and facing an impossible choice. It was hard to reconcile that image with the woman who had raised me with such unwavering devotion to family and tradition. What happened? We dated for about 3 months. Talked about taking me to Ireland someday. About meeting his family in County Cork. He had these big dreams about starting his own construction company, about building a life together. Her voice grew wistful. But then Roberto came back, begging for forgiveness, promising that things would be different. And I was scared, Marcus. Jimmy was exciting, but Roberto was safe. My family knew his family. It made sense in a way that felt ... easier. So you chose Dad. I chose Roberto, yes. I broke things off with Jimmy, and we got engaged again. The wedding was planned for October. She paused, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. But then I realized I was pregnant. The weight of her confession settled over the kitchen like a heavy blanket. I could picture her panic, a young woman in the 1960s facing an unplanned pregnancy from a relationship that had already ended, engaged to a man who believed the child was his. You never told Jimmy? I thought about it. I spent weeks trying to work up the courage to call him, to tell him the truth. But by the time I made the decision, he'd moved back to Boston to work on some big project. I didn't know how to reach him, and part of me convinced myself it was better this way. And you never told Dad? My mother's face collapsed entirely at this question. How could I? We were getting married in 2 months. His whole family was involved in the planning. Everyone was so excited about our new life together. She wiped her eyes with the tissue. I told myself that if I loved Roberto enough, if I was a good enough wife and mother, then it wouldn't matter whose blood you carried. You would be our son in every way that counted. I felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at the deception, sympathy for her impossible situation, and a strange sort of grief for the father I'd never known. Did you ever see Jimmy again? Once. You were about 2 years old, and I ran into him at the grocery store. He'd gotten married, had a daughter of his own. He asked about the baby he'd heard I'd had, and I told him you were Roberto's son. He said you were beautiful and that Roberto was a lucky man. The image of this encounter, my biological father looking at me as a toddler, not knowing I was his child, felt almost too painful to contemplate. Does he know? Did he ever suspect? I don't think so. You looked like me when you were little, and people saw what they expected to see. An Italian baby with an Italian father. But I don't look Italian now. I never really did. You look like my side of the family. My mother had darker features, and I told everyone you got your coloring from her. She reached across the table to touch my hand. Hey, Marcus, I need you to understand something. From the moment you were born, Roberto loved you completely. He never questioned, never doubted. You are his son in every way except genetics. As if summoned by our conversation, I heard footsteps in the hallway. My father appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking confused and concerned. Alina, Marcus, what's going on? It's almost midnight. The moment I'd been dreading had arrived. My mother and I looked at each other across the table, both knowing that the time for secrets had ended. Dad, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, we need to talk. Roberto sat down at the table with us, his weathered hands folded in front of him, his eyes moving between my face and my mother's tear-streaked cheeks. This is about the DNA test, isn't it? My mother gasped. Roberto, how did you? Alina, I've known since the day he was born that Marcus might not be mine biologically. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a secret that had shaped our entire family dynamic. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. You knew? I knew you'd been with someone else during our breakup. You were different when we got back together, sadder somehow. And when you told me you were pregnant, the timing didn't quite add up with when we'd been intimate. He looked at me with eyes full of love and determination. But I also knew that I loved you both, and that genetics don't make a family. Choice makes a family. The three of us sat in silence, processing 32 years of unspoken understanding. My father had raised me knowing I might not be his biological son, and he'd never once treated me as anything less than his own child. My mother had carried the guilt of her secret, while watching the man she'd married love her son unconditionally. Why didn't you ever say anything? I asked. Because it didn't matter, my father said simply. You were my boy from the first moment I held you. You still are. But all the stories about our Italian heritage, about our family history, those are my stories, and now they're yours too. Family isn't just about blood, Marcus. It's about the people who show up, who stay, who love you through everything. That's what makes someone your father. I started crying then, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions I was trying to process. Relief that the secrets were finally in the open, grief for the father I'd never known, gratitude for the one who had chosen to raise me, and guilt for ever doubting the love that had surrounded me my entire life. "I'm sorry," my mother whispered. "I'm so sorry for keeping this from you for so long." "We both are," my father added. "Thought we were protecting you, but maybe we were protecting ourselves too." "What about David?" I asked. "He's not your biological grandson." "He's been our grandson for 7 years," my father said firmly. "That doesn't change because of some test result. He's part of this family, Marcus. He always will be." The conversation continued late into the night, filling in details and answering questions that had been building for months. We talked about Jimmy Sullivan, about my Irish and Middle Eastern heritage that had never been acknowledged, about the complex family dynamics that would need to be navigated going forward. But the most important revelation wasn't about genetics or ancestry or biological connections. It was about the power of choice in creating family bonds, about the way love can transcend blood relations, and about the courage it takes to face difficult truths while maintaining the connections that really matter. When I finally drove home at 3 in the morning, I felt like a different person than I'd been when I woke up that day. Not because my DNA had changed, but because my understanding of what family really means had been completely transformed. Rebecca was waiting up for me, and I fell into her arms in our kitchen, telling her everything through tears that were equal parts grief and relief. "So what happens now?" she asked when I'd finished the whole story. "Now we figure out how to tell David the truth in a way he can understand. We help him see that families can be complicated and beautiful at the same time, that the love we choose to give each other is more important than the genes we're born with." "And Jimmy Sullivan, are you going to try to find him?" I considered this question, thinking about the man who had unknowingly given me half my genetic material, but had never been part of my life. Maybe someday. But right now, I need to focus on the family I have, not the one I never knew. The next few days would bring more difficult conversations, or revelations, and more adjustments to our family's understanding of itself. But that night, held by my wife in the kitchen where we'd first discovered the truth about our genetics, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace with the complexity of love and family and the mysterious ways they intersect in our lives. 3 months after the DNA results turned our world upside down, I found myself sitting in a therapist's office with Rebecca and David, trying to explain genetic inheritance to a 7-year-old in terms he could understand without destroying his sense of security in our family. Dr. Martinez had been recommended by David's pediatrician. As someone who specialized in helping families navigate complex situations involving children, her office was warm and welcoming, filled with toys and books and comfortable furniture that made difficult conversations feel a little less daunting. "So David," Dr. Martinez said, her voice gentle and encouraging, "your parents have told me that you've been learning about genetics and family history. What do you think about all of that?" David, who had been quietly playing with a set of building blocks, looked up with the serious expression he wore when processing important information. "I learned that sometimes the people who raise you aren't the same as the people whose genes you have. But that doesn't mean they love you any less." The simplicity of his understanding took my breath away. Over the past months, Rebecca and I had struggled with how to explain the complexities of our situation, but David had distilled it down to its essential truth. Love transcends genetics. "That's exactly right," Dr. Martinez said. "And how does that make you feel?" "A little confused sometimes," David admitted. "But mostly okay. Papa is still my papa, and Mama is still my mama. I just have some other people somewhere who gave me my genes." Rebecca reached over and squeezed my hand. We'd been worried about how David would process the revelation that I wasn't his biological father. But his resilience had been remarkable. Children, we learned, are often more adaptable to complex truths than adults, who have spent decades building their identities around assumptions. The therapy sessions had been helpful for all of us, providing a safe space to explore the emotions and questions that had emerged since our DNA discoveries. For me, the biggest challenge had been reconciling my sense of self with the knowledge that my entire cultural identity had been based on a misunderstanding. Marcus, Dr. Martinez had said during one of our earlier sessions, "Tell me about how the ancestry results have affected your relationship with your Italian-American heritage." It was a question I'd been grappling with for months. "I feel like an imposter," I'd admitted. "It's like I've been living someone else's life. Every family tradition, every cultural connection I thought was mine, turns out to be borrowed." "But are those experiences any less meaningful because you don't have Italian genetics?" she'd challenged. Did the love you felt at those family dinners disappear when you learned about your DNA? She was right, of course. The memories of growing up in my parents' barbershop, of learning to cook marinara sauce at my mother's side, of celebrating Italian festivals in the neighborhood, none of those experiences had been diminished by what I'd learned about my biological heritage. They were still part of my story, still formative in shaping who I'd become. But I'd also begun exploring the heritage that the DNA test had revealed. Through online genealogy resources and cultural organizations, I'd started learning about my Irish ancestry. It's about the Sullivan family history that had been hidden from me for over 3 decades. I discovered that my paternal grandfather had been a stonecutter who'd emigrated from County Cork in the 1940s, and that I had cousins in Boston I'd never known existed. The Middle Eastern and African components of my ancestry had proven more challenging to trace, but I'd connected with genetic genealogy groups that specialized in helping people understand complex ethnic backgrounds. Each piece of information I uncovered felt like recovering a part of myself that had been lost, while simultaneously feeling like I was betraying the family that had raised me. You're not betraying anyone by wanting to understand your complete heritage, Dr. Martinez had reassured me. Identity isn't a zero-sum game. You can honor the family that raised you, while also exploring the genetic history you never knew about. The most surprising development had been my decision to reach out to James Sullivan's family. After weeks of internal debate and conversations with Rebecca, I'd hired a private investigator to help me locate my biological father. What we'd learned had been both heartbreaking and oddly comforting. Jimmy Sullivan had died 5 years earlier from a heart attack, never knowing he had a son in Rhode Island. But he'd left behind a wife, 2 daughters, and a legacy of community involvement that painted a picture of a man who would have been proud to know me. His family had welcomed me with an openness that had surprised everyone, including themselves. He would have loved knowing about you, his daughter Patricia had told me during our first phone conversation. He always regretted not having a son, and he would have been so proud of the man you became and the family you've built. Meeting my half-sisters had been strange and wonderful in equal measure. We shared certain physical features that I'd never seen reflected in my mother's or Roberto's families. The shape of our hands, the way our eyes crinkled when we smiled, a particular laugh that apparently came from our shared father. But more importantly, we discovered personality traits and interests that seemed to transcend our different upbringings. Patricia was an engineer like me, and her sister Carolyn shared my love of cooking, though she specialized in Irish traditional foods rather than Italian cuisine. We'd started having monthly video calls, sharing stories about our father and gradually building relationships that felt both new and somehow familiar. "Are you going to change your last name?" David had asked me one evening as we were working on a school project about family trees that had become significantly more complicated since our DNA discoveries. "No, buddy. Rossetti is still my name. It's the name of the family that raised me, the family that loved me, the family that made me who I am. Having other genetic relatives doesn't change that." "Good," he'd said with relief. "I like being David Rossetti." The question of David's paternity had been more complex to resolve. The DNA test had definitively established that I wasn't his biological father, which meant that somewhere out there was a man who had no idea he had a 7-year-old son. Rebecca and I had agonized over whether to pursue this information, ultimately deciding that David's emotional stability was more important than satisfying our curiosity about his genetic origins. "If David ever wants to know about his biological father when he's older, we'll help him explore that," Rebecca had said. "But right now, he has a father who loves him unconditionally, and that's what matters most." Well, she was right, as she usually was about these things. My relationship with David hadn't changed because of what we'd learned about genetics. If anything, it had grown stronger because we'd faced this challenge together as a family and emerged with a deeper understanding of what connected us. The extended family had adjusted to our revelations with varying degrees of grace. My parents had continued to treat David as their beloved grandson, making it clear through words and actions that DNA results couldn't alter decades of love and connection. Rebecca's parents had been similarly supportive, embracing the complexity of our family situation with wisdom and acceptance. Some of the aunts and uncles had struggled more with the news, particularly Uncle Tony, who seemed to feel personally betrayed by the revelation that I wasn't really Italian. But even he had come around eventually, especially after seeing how Roberto continued to treat me as his son and David as his grandson without reservation. "Family is what you make it," Roberto had told the extended family during a particularly tense Sunday dinner discussion. Marcus has been my son for 32 years, and David has been my grandson for 7. Some test in a laboratory doesn't change 39 years of love. The neighborhood reaction had been mixed as well. Some of our longtime friends and acquaintances had embraced the complexity of our story, while others had seemed uncomfortable with revelations that challenged their assumptions about family and identity. We'd lost a few friendships along the way, but we'd also deepened others with people who understood that real families are built on choice and commitment, rather than just genetic coincidence. As the months passed, I found myself settling into a new understanding of identity that was more nuanced and inclusive than what I'd carried before. I was still the man who'd been raised in an Italian-American household, who'd learned to cook marinara sauce and appreciate opera and value family above all else. I was also the son of an Irish construction worker, connected to a heritage of immigrants who'd come to America seeking opportunity and building communities through hard work and determination. The Middle Eastern and African components of my ancestry remained somewhat mysterious, but I'd begun reading about the history and cultures of those regions, trying to understand the complex migration patterns that had brought those genetic markers into my family line. Each piece of information I uncovered added depth to my sense of self, rather than replacing what had come before. David had adapted to our family's new complexity with the resilience that children often demonstrate when adults model acceptance and love. He'd started school that fall with a more sophisticated understanding of genetics and family relationships than most of his classmates, but also with an unshakable confidence in his place within our family structure. "My papa isn't my biological father," he'd explained to his teacher during a family heritage project. "But he's still my real father because he chose to be my dad every single day." The wisdom of that statement, coming from a 7-year-old who'd processed more family complexity in 1 year than many people face in a lifetime, reminded me daily of what really mattered in our relationships with each other. Rebecca and I had emerged from the experience with a stronger marriage, having faced a crisis that could have torn many families apart, and chosen instead to use it as an opportunity for greater honesty and deeper connection. We'd learned to communicate more openly about difficult topics, to question assumptions we'd previously taken for granted, and to approach challenges as partners rather than adversaries. "Do you ever regret doing the DNA test?" she'd asked me recently as we were getting ready for bed. "No," I'd answered without hesitation. It was scary and painful and complicated, but living with questions and half-truths was worse than dealing with the reality of what we discovered. David deserves parents who aren't afraid of the truth, whatever it might be. As I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point, I realized that the DNA test hadn't really changed who we were as a family. It had simply revealed who we'd always been beneath the surface. We were people who chose to love each other despite genetic complications, who valued honesty over comfortable fiction, and who understood that the strongest family bonds are forged through shared experiences rather than shared DNA. Looking at David now, as he built elaborate structures with his blocks in Dr. Martinez's office, I felt nothing but gratitude for the path that had led us here. He was still the brilliant, funny, kind-hearted boy I'd been raising for 7 years. I was still the man who'd taught him to ride a bike, who read him bedtime stories, who cheered at his soccer games and helped him with homework. The difference was that now we all understood that those connections were based on choice rather than biology, which somehow made them feel even more precious and intentional. "Papa," David said, looking up from his building project, "can we get ice cream after this?" "Of course, buddy," I replied, ruffling his dark hair that looked nothing like mine, but belonged to the child I'd chosen to father in every way that mattered. Now, when I look at my son, I don't see the questions that once tormented me, or the genetic mysteries that complicated our story. I see only love, not the man who contributed to his DNA, but the truth that set our whole family free to love each other more authentically than we ever had before.